All right, I think I'm good if you are.
All right. What is up, guys and gals? Welcome to episode 58 of the What Makes Us Human podcast. JR, we spent over an hour together via Skype and telephone or phone call, telephone. But I'm still going to say, how are you?
I'm doing well. Yeah, I'm on vacation, but I spent the last hour doing technical support for John. So,
That's right.
but
Yeah.
hey, we got it working.
Boomer
So,
City, baby. Yeah, we got it
I think
working.
TeamViewer is a wonderful tool. That's not they're not a sponsor, but useful tool for those kinds of situations. So we got everything working on your end, and I think we're ready to go.
Yes, sir. All right. So, why don't you tell our guests, our audience, what we are talking about today?
We are going to be talking about a man named John Bumpus Calhoun and rodents.
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 Yep.
So John Bumpus Calhoun, John B. Calhoun, he was born on May 11th, 1917 in Elkton, Tennessee. And like a lot of boys in his time period, he grew up, catching animals, snakes and lizards and rabbits and birds and turtles and all those fun little things. And loved animals, loved being outside. So much to the point that by the time his family moved to Nashville when he was in junior high school, he started attending meetings of the Tennessee Ornithological Society. John, what does the Ornithological Society focus on?
Birds.
Birds. So he just continues right on, with this fascination he has with animals. Publishes his first article in the Journal of the Tennessee Ornithological
There it
Society,
is.
called The Migrant, when he was 15 years old.
Wow, so he was pretty young.
Yeah. So he picks up this love of working with animals, being around animals early on, and he keeps with it. Goes off to school, bachelor's degree from University of Virginia, master's and PhD from Northwestern University, graduating with a PhD in 1943. And the subject of his thesis for his PhD was the 24-hour rhythms of the Norway rat.
That's a big rat.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure that if I was going to pick a focus for a thesis, I'm not sure that anything involving rats would be the topic. But I'm not John B. Calhoun, so his interest in animals and particularly in rodents, eventually he gets him tasked to looking at the problems that the city of Baltimore is having with the Norway rat. The rats are kind of just taking over Baltimore in 1947. So he starts his study. It's supposed to be a 28-month long study where he builds this outdoor pen in his backyard. Wouldn't you love to have this guy for a neighbor?
Yeah.
And it's a 10,000 square foot pen. And he stocks it with rats and begins to
10,000
study
square
them.
feet.
10,000 square feet.
Holy
He lived
cow.
he lived in the suburbs, clearly.
Yeah.
He stocks it with with rats, and particularly Norway rats. And based on his calculations, 5 females over his 28-month time span should have been able to produce 5,000 healthy rodents, new rats. I don't know what you call a baby rat. Do you know? Is there a name for it?
I don't know. It's
We'll
not
just
a
go with
joey.
rats. No. So even though on paper, this large area and the number of rats he had there could have been 5,000 rats in this pen. He found that the population really stabilized at 150. They also didn't kind of like scatter around, but they split off into colonies.
Okay.
With about 12 rats each. And each of these groups sort of stayed in their own separate areas. They didn't grow. They didn't spread out across the whole 10,000 square foot area.
Yeah, because you would think eventually there would just be this enormous mass of rats, walking on top of each other.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of what they were seeing in Baltimore was just masses of rats, and he was expecting this in his pen, his 10,000 square foot pen, and it just didn't happen. So he goes on and he builds a larger area for these for rats and starts the experiment all over in a larger area. And he does this several times. At one point he built one in a barn.
Okay.
So he went to a barn and he had multiple rooms he built into this barn with ramps connecting the different rooms. And still ran into the same thing. The rats would hit a point well below the thousands that they should be, a few hundred, and the population would no longer grow. It would kind of level out. Eventually, he ends up in 1951. No, excuse me, in 1954, he ends up working for the National Institutes of Health. And here, he built his biggest rat. He called it a rat utopia. And this is the early 1960s.
Band name, Rat Utopia.
Yeah. Early 1960s in a mouse utopia. And this time he's working with mice. With these experiments, he kind of jumped back and forth between rats and mice, but saw the same behavior. So early 1960s, they get this facility, National Institute of Mental Health gets this facility outside of Poolesville, Maryland. And he creates this mouse universe in a room that's roughly the size of a small storage unit.
Okay.
It's 9-foot square with 4.5-foot high walls. And he sets this up as this utopia. They have access to great nesting boxes, to all the food and water they want, nesting material they want. Obviously, there's no predators. This should be paradise for mice.
Right. But
he starts to see the same thing. Initially, the population grew rapidly, as you would expect. It doubled. Hold on just a second. It doubled every 55 days.
Wow. Okay.
So by day 315, the population had reached 620. So he started out with 8 in this area, and by day 315, there's 620.
Holy cow! All right.
And these initial 8, 4 pairs were, they were specially selected from the mice that the institute had. it's climate controlled, everything they want. It's the exact opposite of what a mouse in the wild would face.
Oh,
There's
okay, yeah.
no predators trying to get them, no people trying to kill them, no harsh winter conditions. It's even better than the other lab mice because no one's poking and prodding them. They're just being left alone to do their thing.
Well,
There's
somebody's
just a
poking
guy.
and prodding if 8 go to 600.
There's just a guy, John B. Calhoun, and his team who can peer down from up above at them.
Yeah.
So this is so day 315 is August 1969. So 620 in August 1969. But just like with all of his previous experiments, things start to take a turn. Pressure begins to build on the mouse way of life. New generations reach adulthood, but a lot of them couldn't find mates, or they couldn't find places in the social order. So females without mates would retreat up to the high up nesting boxes, far away from all the others, far away from where the families of mice were.
Okay.
And males, similarly, who weren't the top of the social order, just gathered in the middle where the food was and fought. They just fought with each other. They moved around nervously, like they were constantly and kind of anxiously moving around. And the mice who were still producing offspring began to move their nests constantly to try to get away from these other ones that are fighting and causing problems. But even that doesn't go well because they start losing some of their offspring during these moves. They're not keeping track of them when they're moving. They begin kicking some of them out before they're weaned. So they're kicking them out of the nest way too early. So population slows down again. Most of the adolescent mice retreated even further and just spent all their time eating, drinking, sleeping, and grooming. And they even stopped fighting or even attempting to find a mate. And one of the things that Calhoun noticed is these mice were forever altered. He took some of them out and put them in a new space where they didn't have the crowding and the other issues, and they still would not try to find a mate. They would not do the normal things that you would expect an adolescent mouse to do. May of 1970, just under 2 years into his study, the last baby mouse in this mouse utopia was born. And then it just began to decline.
Huh.
So by 1973, the last of the mice from this mouse utopia, which he called Universe 25, I don't think I mentioned that earlier, dies off. So, within less than 5 years, they all die off.
Wow.
In an area where, on paper, everything was perfect. They had everything they could want. They had more space than they theoretically would have needed. And it didn't work. So Calhoun, 1973, publishes his Universe 25 research as a paper called Death Squared: The Explosive Growth and Demise of a Mouse Population. And this is quite interesting academic reading. in his research paper, he quotes quite liberally from the book of Revelation.
Okay.
Things like to kill with the sword and famine and pestilence and wild beast. Um, and he gave these discoveries some catchy names. The mice who forgot how to mate, he called the beautiful ones. The rats who crowd around the water bottles, he called social drinkers. And the overall societal breakdown, he called the behavioral sink. I think this guy maybe was spending a little too much time with mice.
Yeah, but he was really on to something though, because having just come out of the Memorial Day weekend and noticing that we just had the worst school shooting since Sandy Hook in the past 10 days, I think. And even with that reminder, our flags are at half mast. We're remembering over the Memorial Day weekend, we are remembering the fallen soldiers of our country. And yet, still, 38 Americans were shot to death between Friday evening and Sunday night. 38 Americans across the nation were gunned down. This guy was really onto something. It
And
almost sounds,
that was like Chicago, New York City, those areas. Is that kind of
yeah,
what you're driving at?
yeah.
Okay.
Philadelphia had the most this weekend with 13. Baltimore, I think, had 7 or 8. Um, Atlanta, I think, had 7. But it seems as you were, it didn't take long for you to talk about this, and it really is evident to me that if this guy was onto something and he was right, then we have reached our peak population and we're beginning the behavioral sink. you know?
Sure. So that's definitely the parallel that he draws. Um, he even said, uh, "quote I shall largely speak of mice, but my thoughts are on man."
Yeah.
And his observation, and again, this has been debated since he published it, but he says both species are vulnerable to two types of death, that of the spirit and that of the body.
Wow.
Even though he removed the physical threats, doing so had forced the residents of Universe 25 into a spiritually unhealthy situation, full of crowding, overstimulation, and contact with mouse strangers.
Wow.
And in the
That's
1970s,
amazing.
yeah, so in the 1970s, as U.S. cities were seeing a lot of major upticks in crime, and other issues. He definitely has this in mind as he's talking about it. He says, to a society experiencing the rapid growth of cities and reacting in various ways quite poorly, the story of what he sees with the mice seems quite familiar.
Yeah.
Senators brought up his study in meetings.
Huh.
Even Tom Wolfe described New York City as, in the 1970s, early 1970s, described New York City as a behavioral sink.
Okay.
But Calhoun doesn't stop there. So this really gets picked up, and everybody's talking about it. And does this also apply to humans? And what might that mean? And Calhoun's convinced, okay, he's found a real problem. Now he's going to try to fix it. And his theory is that if mice and humans are not afforded enough physical space, perhaps some of that could be made up with conceptual space, creativity, artistry, and community not built around social hierarchies. So he tried to create his later mice universes around what he referred to as being spiritually utopic as well as physically utopic.
Okay.
They had climbing walls. He added all these things that they could do. Um, everything was carefully constructed to maximize happiness for the mice. But what he ran into is, I think, what you see a lot with when a public resource paper comes out like this, you'll see, the news or whoever grab onto it, and everybody in the public starts talking about it. Everyone wants to hear the diagnosis, but nobody wants to hear the cure.
Okay.
So Calhoun began to lose, not just attention, but standing in his community. He began to lose funding. 1986, he was forced to retire from the National Institute of Mental Health, and 9 years later, he died. So he tried to propose solutions, but by then, no one was paying attention.
Right.
And that seems very familiar with what we see today, where somebody comes up with, oh, well, this is why, we have this problem. Okay. But then by the time anybody talks about, by the time people start talking about, okay, how can we address that problem? Nobody's listening. They've moved on to the next thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is so, with our media just literally being the engine that just drives us from one 6-hour period to the next with some people. You go from a shooting to a local car crash on Facebook with your firewire, maybe, and then to another tragedy, and then maybe a small blip about a joyful story between two celebrities that are doing something or something, and then you're on to the very next thing. It's like we are so compartmentalized that you can't hold on to any problem long enough to even begin to try to fix it. Whether it's record numbers of people crossing the border with COVID when we're stuck in our homes and we don't even have COVID back when that was going on, and then you jump to Border Patrol whipping people with whips, and they're not even doing that. They're just using the reins of the horses, and then you're on to a shooting, and then you're on to some stupid thing Donald Trump has said, and then you're on to Joe Biden falling down going up the airplane. I mean, it's just you can't even grasp a hold of a concept. The beehive itself can't even grasp something long enough to even realize there's a problem that needs fixing before they're on to the next problem. And I would say that we are knee deep in the other side of the bell curve with this experiment as a society. We have peaked, and we are gnashing our teeth, forming our tribes. It's just right now everybody's scared to actually pick a real fight. You know what I mean? But it's coming.
Yeah,
I mean, I would say we're knee deep in this.
Yeah, it doesn't help that news media, regardless of which angle the news media is coming from, seems to only exist to spread fear or hatred or some combination of the two.
Panic.
So you keep tuning back in,
Yeah.
so they know if they can push one of those two, you'll keep tuning back in to their channel.
Yeah.
And it's just a never-ending cycle.
And it's a never-ending cycle because they're getting you to tune back in so that you'll be firmly cemented that you're going to vote a certain way. But every single one of us know that the rat that we put in that seat is not going to do a freaking thing that's going to save this country. Every one of us knows that every one of these people that the media are pushing, whether it's Tucker Carlson or whether it's some CNN anchor or MSNBC anchor, Rachel Maddow or Tucker Carlson. There you go. There's one for each of you. They're all rats, and they're selling panic, which is nothing but propaganda. And I said in an earlier podcast, it's been said before, that propaganda is keeping the masses in a constant state of panic. But we all know
panic and anger.
Right. And we all know that even if, regardless of which side wins the vote, it's not going to change. There's still going to be school shootings. There's still going to be poor people. There's still going to be violence in Baltimore. There's still going to be bad cops. There's still going to be soup kitchens because we still have poor people. We're still going to be so compartmentalized that you even are separated when you buy a tent to go camping because you got REI and you got Cabela's. I mean, we are as compartmentalized as we could possibly be, I think. So yeah, it's a hopeless situation.
So some other some other ideas that kind of built on this idea of a behavioral sink. Alan Grant, the co-creator of the Judge Dredd character, if you're familiar with Judge Dredd, acknowledged Calhoun's work as an influence. It appears it may have influenced other apocalyptic fiction as well, like Soylent Green. Edmund Ramsden, who was involved with this and in the discussions around the research afterwards, he was quoted as saying, "At the experiment's end, the only animals still alive had survived an immense psychological cost. Asexual and utterly withdrawn, they clustered in a vacant, huddled mass. In the words of Calhoun's collaborators, the rodent utopia had descended into hell."
Wow. And this is this is all basically coming from overpopulation, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And overpopulation, that doesn't even seem like overpopulation on paper, but because of behavioral areas and the way the society is built and integrates with itself, just because it looks like there's enough room on paper doesn't necessarily mean there's actually enough room.
Okay.
Which is key. But there was another interesting one that initially brought me into this that tied in. A writer named Robert C. O'Brien in the late 60s visited Calhoun's lab, and he met this man who was working with these rodents. And he also took note that on the door going into the lab, there was a Frisbee. This was the scientist's own attempt to, in their words, help when things got too stressful. They toss a Frisbee around. Soon after this, O'Brien wrote Miss Frisbee and the Rats of NIMH, a story about rats who, having been experimented on by humans and gaining intelligence as a result, escaped the lab and attempted to build their own utopia.
Yep.
So, thought that tie-in was interesting. That's a story that most of us probably read as children at some point. And this whole thing was just fascinating. The experiment itself, the possible tie-in to mankind, that again is still debated about and argued about. And then just the simple fact that everyone was eager to talk about his problem that he identified, but no one wanted to pay attention to any solutions that he identified.
Yeah, we seem to be far more to our own demise and detriment. We are far more drawn to our problems than we will ever be to our solutions. You know what I mean?
Yeah, And that's interesting because I wonder what that says about us as a species. Like, what's the purpose to that? Whether you want to look at it as why were we created with that, or whether you want to look at it as why did we evolve with that? What purpose does that serve?
Right. I don't know, but it's
And
over the past 2 years,
yeah.
I find it very frustrating.
So
It's
yeah,
interesting to me that I've listened to a lot of folks on both sides of this philosophical fence, and the secular side, when talking about humanity and our moving forward and why are things the way they are, I've noticed the secularists usually says that if there were a God, he or she or it would have created an environment that would be centered around the greatest good for the most men and women that make up mankind. But you can see in this experiment that even in that situation, where if you took the biblical perspective, the Judeo-Christian perspective of a Garden of Eden situation, and stuck us in that room, per se, we would still find a way to jack that up 6 ways from Sunday, you know? So
yeah. Either way, we
we're
had
screwed.
paradise and we screwed it up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And from the secular viewpoint, if you want to really push on that, I think you really have to say, okay, so if we evolve these traits, what's the purpose? Why haven't those fallen off? They
right.
must serve some higher purpose. And what is it? And I mean, we don't seem to have an answer.
Yeah, what purpose does rage have in a society where the government has a monopoly on violence? You know, how
True.
many thousands of years will you have to go where where the government can only be violent before you lose your rage? I don't know if you'd ever would lose it.
Yeah, I don't think we would, because there are appropriate times for that,
Right.
um, and appropriate outlets for that. But yeah, it's this conversation went a little differently than I expected, but yeah, the whole thing is just it's just fascinating.
And if you watch see what I did was I kind of misunderstood you, I think, but it worked out for the podcast, I think, because I had some real surprise in this. I never even bumped into Calhoun. All that I had never heard. I just looked at the movie.
Oh, the Rats of NIMH movie,
Yeah,
Miss Frisbee and
yeah.
Rats of
So
NIMH.
this
Okay,
really,
yeah,
really hit a nerve in my tooth with this because, um, you know, with Jenner, the character Jenner, um, in the movie, he's in a situation where he's surrounded by rats that they're all suffering from the same issues, but they found ways to benefit from them, and yet he still has found the way to create um, division in the rat colony, and he's become a
yeah.
problem, and he brings with him death and deceit. And so I really see that in the. If you need to watch the movie, folks, if you haven't seen it, it's really 1980s because it came out in '82. It's really dark. Um, it's pretty
I don't.
frightening, to a little kid. I was like 6
Yeah,
when I saw it, but
yeah. I don't know that I ever saw the movie. I remember reading the book, but
Oh,
I may
okay.
or may
All right.
not. I may or may not have seen the movie. But
I just watched it this
if I'm
week.
if I'm remembering correctly, Jenner is the one who, not to give stuff away, like um, basically breaks off and takes some with him. Correct?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we're talking about the same. Yeah. So yeah, and to be fair to you, I said we were going to talk about the Rats of NIMH and kind of the experiment that inspired it. Um, but yeah, we definitely focused more on the experiment side than the story.
And see, the name of the
Um,
movie is The Secret of
movie.
NIMH, but for some reason I remembered it as The Rats of NIMH. But
Yeah, because that
but yet this one.
the book was titled Miss Frisbee and the Rats of NIMH.
Okay, yeah, yeah, yeah. All right. But you see this with we are now. So my grandfather Smith was born in 1916, which kind of hard to believe, to be honest with you. But people on that side of my family had their kids later, obviously. But he would have never dreamed of a world. It wouldn't have been conceivable in his brain to have dreamed of a world in 2022 where our adolescents are forming relationships over something called text and are being
Sure,
intimate. They're being intimate on a text before they even hold hands physically. Like
sure,
you are really seeing this play out in modern times in a way that just 2 generations ago, um, there's no way between the technology and then some of the other things, the social issues that are changing. There's no way he could have conceived of some of the things we're seeing as challenge us today. It just wouldn't have ever been conceivable to him. Um, and the more you talked, the more I even thought of a couple of individuals that I've met in my life, and I thought, well, I have some struggles myself, but I've run across a person or two that their struggles. When you were describing this mouse utopia as it went south, I thought of a person or two that I've come across in my life, and just thought, we're beginning to see physical and mental manifestations of this of these problems, and we are not. If you bring up that we have, especially this week, if you bring up that we have a mental health crisis in our nation, if you were to put that on Twitter, immediately you would be knee deep in a dumpster fire of how you're pro Second Amendment, you know, and that's proof right there that we're in a major cultural sink or societal sink or whatever that guy called it, Calhoun called it, because you can't even,
behavioral thing.
yeah, behavioral sink, because you can't even say, hey, we have a mental health crisis in our country. I had a guy walk up to my wife and I during the 2020 lockdowns. We just went downtown to get some fresh air and walk around our town. And one evening on a Saturday evening, and this man that has come to our church numerous times, who struggles with some mental issues, walked right up to me and told me he was getting ready to kill me. And I knew that he wasn't, but I also know this gentleman, and I know that he really struggles with some mental health issues. Um,
Yeah,
and then he stumbled right up to a sheriff's deputy, and I don't know what he said, but the deputy was there to try to help him, and he sat him down, and they started chit chatting.
yeah,
But yeah, but if I were to bring up right now on social media that we have a mental health crisis in our nation, everybody would think I'm referencing the Second Amendment and the latest school shooting. So it's yeah, you just really see it. I'm just repeating myself now, but this was
yeah,
you really caught me off guard with this one. I really enjoyed this one.
yeah. And I think one last thing is, um, when it comes to technology, mankind has always been eager to push technology forward, maybe before we understand the implications and how to how to
Yes.
deal with it. So
Yes.
there's definitely a delay that results. New technology is not inherently good or bad necessarily. It's how we handle it and what we do with it.
Yeah.
And a lot of times we haven't figured that out before we just release it to the world and see what happens.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that definitely has quite an impact.
I personally believe that the internet, I told my buddy Craig here recently, just in another discussion a couple weeks ago, that I believe the internet is going to be looked back on being compared to a buzzsaw being stumbled upon by a Neanderthal in the cave. And he just cranks it up and starts walking around the dark cave where a lot of other Neanderthals are sitting. And he's just a bloodbath. You know, it's something that we think we understand, but we don't quite comprehend the damage that we can do with it. And we certainly are not comprehending the good that can be done with it, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's like a power tool being discovered by some half evolved man and then him just drilling the heck out of everybody with it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think while the internet has had a lot of benefits, I think it has definitely spotlighted the total depravity of man in a way that just has put it on display in a way that we have seen other times in history, but we've rarely seen in history.
Right.
So,
yeah.
All right. Anything else?
Yeah, but we got to pull a plug at some point. Man, that was really good. Like I said, the combination of me misunderstanding and just watching that movie. I really took a punch that not many people are going to take from this one. Just because I just watched most. I didn't get to see all of it, but I watched 99% of that film. And then to hear this, I was just like, yep. And I'm just thinking of characters in the movie, you know. So I will say once again, real quick, that it can be easy to get caught up in the panic. It's not our natural state to stop and walk outside and smell the sunshine. You know what I mean? That's just not our normal response. And if you're really struggling with that and you're having a lot of issues and you feel like you're just 10 feet underwater and you can't get out, then you need to tell a good friend that you feel that way. And it's okay to tell them that, and they'll be glad that you did tell them that. Because we're in a situation where a lot of rats are taking themselves out nowadays, and we don't need that. So
yeah, and actually do get outside even if you don't want to, because vitamin D has a lot of benefits, including mental health benefits. So,
and chances are, if you're outside in the sunshine, you're not looking at your phone and the news. Yeah.
So
well, I enjoyed it. I appreciate it.
Yep. Well, folks, you can find us on social media at WMUH Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. You can email us wmuhpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
Yep. Like, rate, and subscribe, and we'll see you next week.